happens to be in this format. So yeah, thanks for having me here today. And just a little bit about me. I live on an island called Vashon. It's a true island, no bridges. You have to take a ferry to get off the rock, but it's close to Seattle. And my company is Blink, which is an evidence-driven design organization. And so it's been around for like 23 years now. It started in the Seattle area, but now we have offices also in San Francisco, San Diego, Boston, and Austin, as well as people work, well, pretty much everybody works remotely. Our offices are used for our research activities, which make up a really big part of our work, doing foundational research and usability studies for digital products and services. And then often that research then becomes a design component where we'll do the interaction design, visual design, usually handing that off to developers at our client organization, or we also provide those services. And so my job is as our accessibility director. And so the philosophy that we have for accessibility is that we like everyone in the organization to understand how to employ accessibility in their own work. And so we don't have an accessibility department or to create any bottlenecks. Essentially, I help all of our researchers understand how accessibility fits into what they do. Our designers, I'll mentor about how to build accessibility into their work, and so on for everybody within the organization. And then the other part that I do is to help evangelize accessibility to our clients and our prospects to get them to invest in accessibility. Ideally, we'd like to have accessibility as an important part of every project. We are attentive to it in every project, but it always helps if there's investment to do things comprehensively, robustly, and really think about how to do good accessibility. And so that ends up being the core of what I'm talking about today, which is about accessibility within a design system. And I'm hanging it on a case study for one of our longtime clients, which is NASA. And it's a great example of a design system with accessibility, partly because, or for one reason, is because it was just such a large project that there was, we were able to essentially do everything we would have liked to do with accessibility. And the other part of it is that NASA is also really good about allowing us to share information about their work. And so a lot of times it's hard to be able to talk about work that's under NDA, but I'm able to talk about these types of things. I will try to monitor the chat, because I'm happy to grab things as they come along. But we'll definitely have time at the end where we can pick those types of things up. And yes, so somebody mentioned NASA redesign is a dream project. It was a dream for a lot of us as well. I've always been someone very interested in the types of things that NASA does. And in fact, as we got into the project, as they've been our client, we found out how many things NASA does that are beyond maybe the space exploration parts that they're most known for. And if you may be familiar with NASA, but you may not have an idea of the reach of content that's out there. So disseminating as much as possible of their information is one of the missions of that organization, is to be have their content broadly available. And as I list on this slide here, there are close to 3,000 sites, and those are managed by dozens of organizations that are either part of NASA in terms of the official organization, but then they also include all of the various research organizations, universities that are closely affiliated with NASA. And they have applied accessibility to those sites because it for a long time, accessibility has been a requirement for government websites to be attentive to. However, that accessibility work has been, it hasn't had a central formal design to it just because of all the different sites and how they're managed. I have a screen capture here. It's just a typical NASA website as it exists, as it existed when we started this project. Just point to mention is that I've included alternative text descriptions of the images, but I will also describe pieces that are relevant to this particular presentation. So the image that I'm showing right now just features the multimedia style content that is common to most NASA sites, which is a lot of great photography, along with a lot of great content in text, usually of a scientific nature, also charts, graphs, video pieces from various missions and interviews and so on. The project that we were involved with had been funded by legislation that was specifically identified to improve digital experiences for our federal government agencies. And so NASA, of course, is one of those. And one of the 8 objectives of that legislation was about accessibility. And so it was a requirement. And so us having the contract for that meant that we had to make sure that all the work that we did measured up to what's called in shorthand Section 508, which is essentially a certain part of the information that identifies the requirements that government organizations have to follow with respect to accessibility. One of the fun things that we had the opportunity to do here was to not just adjust and improve legacy sites, but take a completely different view. So essentially, this was a redesign from the ground up, and there was actually a moratorium put on most sites in terms of new sites and significant designs for so that all of the efforts would go into the new design that we were fortunate to be able to work on. And one of the things that they wanted to do, which feeds directly into great accessibility, is to have some standardization about the design and layout and structure of all of those many thousands of websites that I mentioned, so that and accessibility really works well when there's standard methods that are used, tested, and that just makes things much easier for accessibility. This project started, actually the project started in 2019, went into 2020 with some strategy and design. There was development all through 2021, and that continued into last year, and now it's lapped over into this year, where the development based on our design is in full flow right now. And so hopefully sometime this year that information will be well available to the worldwide general public. One of the things that ties into great accessibility is being able to conduct accessibility from the very beginning of a process and having buy-in from the stakeholders from the very start. We were really fortunate that that was the case here. So NASA is a huge organization. It's got a really big hierarchy. Like any large organization, it tends to have a lot of very busy people, making sure that everything keeps moving along. But we were able to have key stakeholders involved in the earliest meetings of where this project was going to go. And in addition to talking about research, content strategy, design, accessibility was included as an activity all the way from the very start of the process. And so that kind of tied in with our philosophy, which is, as we start doing our discovery and planning, we want to have checkpoints about how accessibility is being considered. When we get into research, accessibility considerations, and the same all the way through the process, which I'll point out as we kind of look at the different activities that we're involved with on this project. And so it covered research, interaction design, visual design, motion design. And research is a big part of what we do. There are a lot of aspects of the research, but we're also in the foundational research part. It was about identifying people's experiences with the current content sites that were available at the time, finding out what people enjoyed, what was more challenging. And unfortunately, since accessibility was a part of that, we included questions related to accessibility. And so that also gave us ammunition, or it gave us the ability to have supporting information for what we do as we move forward. And people identified in that foundational research that there's a significant percentage of people that had disabilities and accessibility needs. This is a really large survey, and so the percentage of people indicating that they had disabilities or accessibility needs, more or less matched general figures about that, which usually ends up about 25 or 20% of the population has some type of disability, either permanent or temporarily through or situational disabilities, with most of them being people that have disabilities that are physical challenges that they've had all their lives. And we also ask questions about whether they were able to find the information that they needed, and people with disabilities identified that they were significantly challenged in many parts of using the existing website. So on this screen, I have just a couple of the pie charts. The alt text, it can be read out in the actual handout that I provided with some information on that data. Another part of the research was looking at what other science sites related to space and technology might have relevant elements for us to consider. And so then that led into learnings to hand off to our design team. And so we included accessibility considerations as part of that. And so, for example, if we identified that a certain site had an interesting way of presenting information, let's say it might have been a carousel, such as a combination of imagery, text, and possibly motion video, how accessible was that experience? What made it more accessible or less accessible. And so again, that information was included in our evaluation criteria. As part of our research, we talked to participants that had a wide range of disabilities, across all of the major categories of vision, hearing, cognition, and mobility. We also had contractors involved who also had disabilities, which provides us with insights that you simply can't have. So for myself, being a sighted person, I can use tools to identify some things that are a challenge for a person who is blind. But for example, as I'm showing a screen capture here, which is from one of our research studios video streams, and it has an image of one of our contractors, Zach, who's been blind from birth, who helps us with projects, and he's reviewing a certain one of the NASA sites on an iPhone using touch and audio response to be able to identify what's going on that particular site. And so those additions to our team are extremely valuable. Let's see, there's a question about, they're curious about NASA's tool set, what tools they use to manage their templates, components, design system, documentation. Well, that's something that is going on right now by developers that are contracted separate from our activities. Essentially, for our research and design, we use the tools that had been ones that are familiar to us. So on the design side, like many organizations, we use Figma for doing quite a lot of both prototypes and the documentation. And as I'll show later, that also became a way that we documented accessibility components in the design system. How did WCAG guidelines, if any, factor into how you developed accessibility for users? The accessibility guidelines are extremely important because they contribute to what became the Section 508 federal government regulations. And so that's one of my roles as accessibility director, is to understand that. The WCAG, however, is really large. There's hundreds of items there. Our approach is to make it easier for our practitioners so that they'll learn about the WCAG guidelines that are relevant to, let's say, research, to interaction design, to visual design. And that helps make it less overwhelming for somebody that's learning about accessibility, because not every role needs to have to learn everything about every particular guideline. But it was something that was important for us to consider. You referenced 2.2, which is the latest, which includes a lot of mobile guidelines, and so that's something that's going to come out in a later version of the work. So it was 2.1 that represented most of the activity in this activity. All right, so just moving on from that, and then another item is that we did look at the legacy sites, understanding that we're moving forward and our designs were going to be taking a new look that would encompass all of the different legacy sites that existed. But we did want to see what had been done, what were common things that were done on NASA sites, and where were there issues that we wanted to consider. And so, we looked at the different sites, and we identified things that, well, you'll identify in a lot of projects, like keyboard traps, where there's items that need focus and don't receive that, text that needs more context if you're working with a screen reader, complex objects like carousels, which I'll show a little bit more about later. And then screen capture I'm showing here is just one of the legacy sites that is marked up with that then had accompanying text identifying the challenges with those particular sites. And as part of that, we also did a kind of a simple grading system, which the people at NASA found very of interest, because it allowed everyone to get an idea of the sites that had the least amount of accessibility challenges to the ones that had more challenges. And this is where our accessibility contractors got involved, essentially to identify what the items were that we were going to look for in these legacy sites. And then we created a report based on that. And some of the things that I point out here are things that, again, that commonly come up as accessibility issues, like the organization of a menu and labeling, headings, alternative text, information widgets. So by widget, I mean something that is more or less complex, that has a lot of aspects to it. A multimedia element. Often widgets are created as separate objects, and then they're embedded or called on by websites. If those widgets aren't designed accessibly, then of course they're not going to work accessibly within the when somebody is consuming the site. Now, a broader view of accessibility is to talk about it as inclusive design, where it's the idea that by thinking about everyone from the very start, we can make a product that works for everyone. People with disabilities have to be considered in that, but if we consider those challenges early on, along with the challenges of other abilities, then often we can come up with a solution that just improves things for everyone. So our work with the menu navigation was part of that, so that our interaction designer, who is assigned to this project, was able to develop a layered menu that accomplished going deep into a hierarchy, yet not requiring a lot of steps to be able to reveal that content. And in the handout, including I think in the PDF, you should be able to see a motion graphic of that. But essentially, as a sighted user, you'd identify that there are tiers of content, but that there are limited number of mouse clicks that you would have to make to be able to get to any one place. That's really important for somebody who may be blind using a screen reader and keyboard only access, because the screen reader needs to read information from the screen, and if there are a lot of options available, essentially the screen reader has to move through all those options, which is much slower than being able to glance at it as a sighted user. Also, with mobility impairments, it can be more difficult to be able to manipulate menus, and so being able to have them as compact as possible is an important strategy. Another thing that is present in this screen capture is on the top left corner of the site is where the search is. And these are small things about accessibility, but for people that rely on screen readers and have mobility impairments, navigation is a big, it takes a lot, it takes up a lot of time and work. The single biggest aid can be search. Where is the search box on most sites? It's usually not in the logical first place that keyboard access would go to on a site. Often it ends up on the top right at the end of a series of menu items. So a person with using a screen reader is going to have to investigate all of those items to get to the one which ultimately may provide them with the most utility, which is the search. And so just by moving that to the first logical point that a person would encounter with a screen reader in their keyboard just makes it easier. I mentioned that we had design system documentation, and so there was a very robust set of items that were provided. Which was all the documentation was also in Figma, and it included the nested layers of information from the most granular through to components into templates. All of that was documented for all of the elements that a person would interact with on the site. And so then as part of that, we had accessibility notations attached to those same items. So if a component was a button, the relevant accessibility label and interaction information was there in the documentation. The screen captures that I'm showing show in one of them accessibility notation elements, which are a visual cue, but also have alt text associated with them. But that actually came out of work that Adobe had done for using objects to help identify accessibility elements in prototypes. And you'll see how those are used as I go on to some more slides. Another screen capture that you see here is some of the pros, some of the instructions attached to the different components. And so in many of the components, keyboard navigation would be associated with that. And in this particular example, it's talking about how the tabbing works on the particular template that it was attached to. And so we tried to put as much documentation here about our thoughts about accessibility that would benefit the developer as possible, so that when the developers receive the design system specification, they would have accessibility information to build on. So even if they hadn't been working with accessibility, they'd clearly see that there were instructions about that, and they could then move forward with their own execution of that. But at least we made sure that we made that available. All right. So now I get into talking about interaction design. I've already mentioned keyboard-only access. And so that is vitally important for people who are using screen readers, as well as people who may be sighted but have significant mobility challenges. For example, one of our contractors has cerebral palsy, and Blake is highly reliant on using keyboard-only access to interact with sites, as our Zach, who's blind. And keyboard-only access is something that doesn't get as much consideration, having had 3 decades or more of graphical user interfaces where the mouse and then touch have been the primary methods of interaction. But keyboard only access is important. And once you identify that it is important, then the next important part to that follows along from that is that you create a map for the ideal recommended keyboard path through a particular page. It's not that a person couldn't find their own way through that, but it's just that there's some thought that goes into that, and then that's added to the design specification. So in the screen capture I have here is a prototype of one of the page templates that is showing a featured video with some supporting text, and then supplemental related videos on that particular page. And the blue, there are icons that are part of those notation elements that I mentioned that are included that shows the numbered order to set up the keyboard path through this particular page. And so when the developer gets the specification, they don't really have to, think through the whys and the wheres of that. It's more about, oh, all right, I have now a recipe. I have a blueprint for what's been determined as the best keyboard design path, and now I'll just I'll code things in the appropriate order as it's done in the design specification. And then my next slide is just more information about keyboard only access that also gets into thinking about labeling and scrolling. Horizontal scrolling can be a very difficult concept for a person who is blind to create a mental model for, and labeling of components is also extremely important. So the visible words that may be on a button or a control are great for sighted users. However, accessibility guidelines require and recognize the need for there to be a way for screen readers to audibly report on what a particular control is. And so that goes into the design considerations as well. And another element that is available for sites is to identify clusters of content, and that is expressed in the design specification as well. So in the screen capture, I'm showing a page template that is for upcoming events, and it has 3 cards that are representing different events. Now, those 3 cards together can be identified as a cluster of content. That cluster of content can be labeled so that someone using a screen reader is able to have those labels audibly reported, which speeds things up considerably. So let's say you had an array of cards and there were 12 cards. By using content clusters, a person can identify immediately what that cluster is about from its label, and then determine whether to skip that cluster and move on to another one, or then move through the different items in that cluster. And those are referred to as ARIA landmarks. And that kind of gets into the more complex aspects of accessibility. So we have like 30 years of great information about how to build accessible websites, and some of them are more straightforward than the others. This is one that gets a little bit more advanced, but it's extremely important when you have content that starts to get more complex and robust. And it requires an understanding and some experience with how screen readers work. So so that everyone can recognize the importance of addressing issues like this. In the visual design portion, color contrast is an important part of the guidelines for accessibility, and there are different thresholds. One of the people in the chat mentioned WCAG, WCAG, Web Content Authoring Guidelines. Those have been around for a long time. They have different thresholds, A, AA, AAA. AA is generally considered the level that is recognized as doable for most organizations. Sure, it's going to take some time to invest in that, but it's recognized as that's kind of the baseline area. The foundational area are the A's. Those are the things you really have to do, where you have next to no accessibility in a site. The AAA is more aspirational. With color contrast, it's relatively easy to design for AAA. Color contrast is specifications that are based on ratios that go into research of foreground and background color combinations, and people with different types of vision challenges, and there are a lot of different types of vision challenges. And essentially, tables have been created with ratios of hexadecimal color combinations. Unfortunately, then there's tools that allow you to a visual designer to interactively examine colors and then get a statement as to whether or not that meets guidelines. And there are a lot of color contrast tool checkers. They're easy to find. If you type in color contrast checker in Google, you'll see all kinds of options for that. But the plugin we were using for Figma had color contrast checker as part of that. And so then that became part of our design specification. And so in the design specification, we identified the colors that were intended to be used. There's also background documentation as to the color contrast ratios that were identified. And then that documentation in Figma also should be accessible. And that's something I haven't talked about yet, but it's recognizing that design in general is highly, highly visual. And in a lot of ways, that creates blockers to people who may be blind to even get into design. And that's unfortunate because a person who is blind can have great contributions to design. However, if the tools that we're using aren't accessible and the documentation that we're developing isn't accessible, then that means that our teammate who is a designer who may be blind just simply isn't able to contribute to the work. And so having our documentation accessible is also something that we consider. And so in the screen captures that I'm showing, it shows a visual indicator of a green color with a check mark, but the documentation also includes an underlying alternative text that says that that item is passed. Is a PASS, pass. And let's see. Oh, and yeah, so what's the name of the plugin? Shani mentioned Stark is one of them. And yes, Stark was the plugin that we used on that product or on this project. And so the Stark plugin is a really good one. It works with more than color combinations, but in the screen capture that I'm showing, it is identifying how the tool works, where essentially you've created a certain foreground background color combination. You can highlight that in Figma, and then the plugin can automatically identify the ratio and whether or not it passes the WCAG guidelines. So accessibility plugins are available on Figma, as are so many thousands of others that are available for Figma today. Let's see, I'm just checking on time. I'm trying to hit questions as we go along here, and I think we'll be able to be done on time. I do want to mention search engine optimization as it relates to accessibility, because I think most people aren't familiar with it, with this relationship. So there's a lot of serendipity between doing accessibility and achieving great search engine optimization. So it turns out that a lot of the coding that is accessibility related that we would do with a great accessibility product also provides great signals to the bots that search engines are using as they go through the public facing web. And so on this slide, I have just a lot of examples, but alternative text, having descriptive headings, using header tags H1, H2 in a logical manner, having sitemaps, table of contents, lists, breadcrumbs, all of these types of things that will benefit content development, benefit accessibility, and then those are signals that are used by the search engine search engines. And so I like to bring this up because in a lot of organizations, SEO may get more traction for funding than accessibility. But if you bring accessibility into that same conversation, essentially you can say, let's do great accessibility, and then we're automatically increasing the search engine optimization of our site by doing good accessibility. Just looking ahead to next steps, these are some things we're actually working on right now. So even though there's a development phase in process for things that have been designed, there's also things that still need to be designed. And complex objects are one of the ones that we're working on right now. So NASA has a lot of complex objects like dynamic interactive orbiting of asteroids, where you can use a mouse to be able to move to different points in time, different places, points in space, and identify what asteroids are there or when an asteroid will be there. Those things are really difficult to make accessible without putting in an amount of time to figure out how to do that. A simpler example is a carousel. And for a sighted person, it's pretty simple to consume that, and they're nice objects. So, oh, there's a pretty picture. There's some text about that pretty picture. I can see that there is a button to advance it forward and back, and now I can move through this slideshow. Well, each of those things that I mentioned has an accessibility component. First of all, with the images, making sure that there's a good description of that in alternative text. Then there's the button placement, making those set up so that they're can be interpreted by a screen reader, and then that a person who's blind working with the carousel can even understand that all of these pieces are working together as this entity that we call a carousel. And another screen capture from the Mars site shows dashboards from sort of a fictional spacecraft, and these dashboard gauges have a lot of information, but how do you make those so that the individual components on them are accessible, but then a person can understand what the object is that they're even interacting with. And some more next steps is planning for content development, and this is where we get into business processes. So a lot of the accessibility issues about content require the content creators to do things as they develop content, include that along with their content into whatever publishing system is used, so that then ideally it's accessible once it's published without requiring further remediation. Looking at things like data tables, how to be able to make those accessible, and then PDFs. NASA sites use thousands and thousands of PDFs, and those need to be accessible as well. With PDFs, it usually goes back to the publishing system. Is the original content in an accessible form? Does the publishing system support accessibility? In that case, your PDFs are probably going to be accessible. So now we continue to work on this as development continues. We're there as a liaison to help interpret our design specification, and then also available for final audit to make sure that in the end, the sites are accessible after they've all been executed in code. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Jim, were there some things that I need to catch up on from questions?
Three questions, and Andrew's going to share his here in the minute here. And if you can put that in chat, we'll get to yours as well. The first one is, what are the audience demographics of NASA's website? What type of people are using it, or who is it trying to target?
All right. Well, there's two parts to that. One is that the NASA audience, they like to think of as being worldwide and fully diverse, in that there's information there that could be of interest to anyone along whatever demographic slices that you want to identify. As part of the research, we did identify certain what became certain personas that represented large groups. And so, for example, students and educators were an important part of that. There were also people that were technology enthusiasts, was a large category. Then there are people that are more mainstream consumers of science information, where they might have seen something in the news about a mission and they go to the NASA site to learn about that, yet they're not going to go deep into the technology or do the same type of learning as one of the other groups. So yeah, just millions and millions of potential users. But then we tried to be attentive to those specifics.
Great. So here's one for visual elements and users who are able to view the screen. How do you conduct tests on what information, color, or text box the eye is focused on, and improve how to visibly navigate the site? So they're asking about like eye tracking and that sort of thing.
So eye tracking is certainly one approach to that. We didn't do that. That wasn't part of the work that we did with the foundational research. It potentially could come out after some of the prototypes have been rendered into like a beta version of the site, and then we could identify that. We really relied more on our contractors to help us identify from their knowledge of other experiences, what things about a menu would make it more accessible than others. But there is going to be a usability step after the pages start to be ready in that beta format before final release, and that's where we'd be able to do testing on the specifics of people actually working with the new design.
Oh, excellent. Andrew has a question about accessible and meaningful hyperlinks. This is always a good one. He's learned that click here is the most despised hyperlink, especially for blind users. In your experience, should meaningful hyperlinks start with a verb? And he gives the example of application form as the hyperlink versus download application form. So one being the noun, one being the verb with the noun.
You know, if we look at the kind of the UX writer genre within user experience, there's just so many good learnings about, you know, the best way to present that information. Your example of click here obviously is the negative one, because it doesn't provide that indication of what's to come. Now, the critical thing here is that for people who are sighted without mobility impairments, it's pretty easy to click around, and if it's we then get to the next page and all right, that's not what I'm looking for. Click the back button, move on, and try something else. With people who may have disabilities, essentially you're talking about making things more complex and requiring a lot more time. So it benefits everyone to have a good descriptive link. But for example, take our contractor, Blake, who has mobility impairments. Blake works really with 2 fingers, and it roughly can take 10 times as long to be able to click an item as it might for me. So now just multiply that out by all the bad links that you click on, all the backlinks that you have to click on. And there's just this enormous waste of time because of that. And so having descriptive links is highly beneficial to people that have disabilities.
Fantastic. 2 last questions. The first one is actually building on the previous audience question. Chassis is curious if there's an overlap between designing for kids and designing for accessibility.
That's a good question. I don't think I ever had that question.
I haven't heard that one either. That's a new one.
Exactly. However, if you wanted to, first of all, I guess you'd have to break down the attributes, you know, about kids that are kind of common to kids, as well as identifying things that are more edge cases for kids, because you want to look at, you know, all the different areas. But then let's say you might identify that for younger children, that their learning or reading level may be different from older children. And you know, what you can find is, when you're looking at cognitive neurodiversity issues related to accessibility, is that you also have to recognize that you have to recognize that to make sure that your content is appropriate and can be, you know, consumed by everyone that you know, that is interested in that. And so, like, a reading level could be an accessibility issue that would come across, you know, both those groups.
That is a great question. Last one. Javon asks, I remember you mentioned that mobile accessibility is part of a future prototype project. Can you talk briefly about how the team approaches and solves these accessibility concerns on the mobile side?
All right, yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, there are always the technical issues of accessibility, which is what do you need to do with the underlying coding to be able to make things accessible so that they work with screen readers and keyboard only access and that type of thing. On the mobile side, if you talk specifically about the 2 prominent platforms, iOS and Android, it's important to know that those platforms have built-in native accessibility that is extremely powerful. and they can do things that we don't necessarily have as easily on the desktop browse or desktop laptop browsing side. And so you don't want to get in the way of those. So for example, on iOS, VoiceOver is an incredibly valuable screen reader. And as you do your development, you want to pay attention to how they've implemented VoiceOver so that your work can benefit from that rather than get in the way of that. And iOS and Android have just wonderful levels of accessibility built in. Now, the other part of it is on the design side, and that's where you get into things like target size become really important and create design dissonance. Smaller targets, again, going back to one of our testers, Blake, with Blake's mobility impairment, the size of a button or any target is much better the larger that it is. However, as we look at our mobile devices, often we reduce the target size because the overall canvas size is reduced. And so you start to, have to consider those types of things as you work and think about accessibility. And then being touch interfaces, there's a whole set of accessibility considerations related to touch. So those are just a couple of things, but you can, there's a baseline set of accessibility principles that you want to consider. But then as you start to fine tune the differences, let's say in a responsive site between the one for desktop laptop and the one that's for smaller screen devices, there are some things that you want, that fine tuning wise, you're going to have to do with accessibility to optimize those.
Yep. I threw a couple links to Apple's and Google's accessibility mobile design guidelines. You can check.
All right, great.
Fantastic. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for asking fantastic questions this evening. I'm glad you could all join us. As always, you can visit the site on Meetup to find out about upcoming events and register on Zoom. And if you're interested in giving a talk yourself, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. It could be a talk, could be a in-person event, it could be a workshop, whatever you like. So thank you, Joe. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. We deeply appreciate it. Have a fantastic rest of your night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody. Good night.